You can feel it long before you check your bank balance. The escalating rent. The utility bill that used to be a nuisance, but now feels like a heavy burden. The grocery bill that seems to grow larger each month. Right now, millions of Americans are waking up, heading to work, enduring long commutes, and silently wondering the same painful question. These aren't sensational headlines or exaggerated stories. These are real lives. A young woman, faithfully saving money every payday, only to withdraw it for essentials like gas and food. A man working 6 days a week, driving 4 hours daily to reach his job, yet admitting that he can no longer afford the one thing that brings him joy. Families looking at power bills of $600 or more and questioning what they're doing wrong. But the truth is, they're not making mistakes at all. Because if you've ever Googled the cost of living in America in 2025, you already understand what's going on. Wages are falling behind, essential goods are more expensive than ever, and the divide between surviving and truly living has never seemed so vast. This video isn't just about statistics. It's about the lived experience behind those numbers. It's about understanding why everything feels more expensive, how we got to this point, and what it means for everyday Americans who feel like they're sprinting just to keep up. Stick around until the end, because the first step in avoiding being overwhelmed by this system is understanding it. What you'll notice when you listen to young Americans today isn't laziness, entitlement, or unrealistic expectations. It's sheer exhaustion. Not the tiredness from a long workday, but the weariness of battling a system that gets more oppressive every year. One story that stands out to me is of a woman in her 20s who responds to older generations advising her to just work harder like they did. Her response is blunt and direct. It's not the same. You ruined this country. Behind the anger lies a deep frustration that the rules her parents followed simply don't exist anymore. And she's right about one thing. The economic environment has changed in ways older generations didn't have to contend with. Back in the late 70s and 80s, wages and housing costs grew in tandem. You could buy a house in your 20s without needing a six-figure salary or years of saving. A college degree didn't come with a burden of debt that haunted you into middle age. Expenses like healthcare, childcare, and car payments were all much more affordable in comparison to wages. Today, when adjusted for inflation, the average worker earns about the same as they did in 1979. Yet, the costs of essential goods have skyrocketed by over 70%. This isn't about placing blame on one generation over another. It's about recognizing that the financial framework that once held America up has shifted. Easy credit and low interest rates fueled a decades-long rise in asset prices, driving up the costs of homes and investments. Corporate consolidation means fewer companies control the essential services we rely on daily, from groceries and utilities to healthcare. When a few major players dominate an industry, prices don't just climb, they stay high, regardless of how much families struggle. While older generations often had the luxury of a single full-time job that comfortably supported a household, younger generations are struggling in an economy where even two jobs barely cover basic expenses. This creates a sort of mental whiplash. The advice remains the same: work hard, save diligently, and make smart choices just as their parents did. But the numbers no longer align with those promises. The price of achieving middle-class stability has surged faster than wages, opportunities, or even hope itself. So when younger people say it's not the same anymore, they're not seeking pity, they're demanding honesty. Do you think the American economy today requires more effort but delivers less in return than it did for past generations? For millions of Americans, the housing crisis isn't just a statistic or a talking point in the media. It's the moment you sit in your car after a long workday and wonder how you'll make rent next month. One woman from Florida perfectly captures this experience. She pays $1,300 in rent, a $650 car payment, and $300 for insurance, all while still juggling utility bills, groceries, and other expenses. Her voice trembles as she says, "I either eat or I pay my bills." She continues, "And even then, I'm left wondering which bill will be late this month." This isn't financial mismanagement. It's the reality of housing costs outpacing the average American salary. The statistics support her situation. The median home price in the U.S. is around $410,000 to $420,000, nearly 6 times the median household income. This ratio, which used to be 3 to 1, has doubled within a generation, making homeownership more about luck than hard work. Even renting, which was once seen as an affordable alternative, has become a steep challenge. The average rent for a one-bedroom apartment nationwide is now about $1,500 a month. While this is lower than the peak in 2022, it's still around 15% higher than pre-pandemic levels. In cities like San Diego, New York, Boston, and Miami, a typical one-bedroom apartment can easily cost $2,500 to $3,000 per month. Housing costs haven't come down, they've simply reached a new, expensive normal. But why is this happening? It's not just one factor, it's a combination of issues. For years, the U.S. has failed to build enough homes to meet the growing demand. Construction slowed significantly after the 2008 financial crisis and never truly recovered. Meanwhile, mortgage rates have climbed from historic lows to 6% and 7%, closing the door on many first-time buyers. Private investors, from individual landlords to large institutional buyers, have stepped in, purchasing tens of thousands of homes and turning what should have been starter homes into rental properties. In states like Florida and Texas, the cost of property insurance has skyrocketed due to climate risks, pushing monthly ownership expenses even higher. When shelter becomes both scarce and expensive, there is no incentive for prices to drop. Families are forced into a competitive housing market, and the competition only drives prices higher. The impact isn't just financial, it's generational. The average age of a first-time homebuyer is now in their mid-30s, the oldest it's ever been. For many, renting has become a permanent situation, not a temporary one. Without the ability to build home equity, wealth gaps continue to widen. People feel trapped, not because they're unwilling to work hard, but because the gates to stability are locked behind rising costs and dwindling options. Even for those fortunate enough to secure housing, the challenges don't end there. Once you've got the keys to your new place, another wave of expenses hits, and it often feels like they're more burdensome than the rent itself. These hidden costs can be a serious shock. Many Americans find that the real financial strain doesn't come from the mortgage or rent payment. It's everything else that piles on top. These are the bills that are impossible to ignore, the ones that arrive unexpectedly, making your heart drop when you see them. Take one woman in Texas, for example, who recently shared her summer electric bills: $560 in June, $650 in July, and a projection that August would push her total over $2,000 for just 3 months. She wasn't living in a lavish home, nor was she wasting electricity. In fact, she was cutting back on everything cooking at home, avoiding extra purchases, and it still wasn't enough. While her situation may seem extreme, it mirrors a growing trend across the country. On average, electric bills run about $150 a month on paper, but that number doesn't reflect the reality for many households. In areas plagued by long heat waves, outdated grid systems, or heavy reliance on air conditioning, it's common to see bills hit $600 or more during peak months. Beyond electricity, water bills have surged in many major cities. High-speed internet, once a luxury, is now a near-essential household expense, and car insurance premiums are climbing across the nation. Individually, each of these increases might seem manageable, but when added together, they become another significant monthly obligation, a second rent, if you will. Then, there's the daily cost of getting to work. One man described his routine: nearly 4 hours of driving each day, working 6 days a week, only to realize he no longer has the time or money for the simple pleasures in life. This isn't an isolated case. Car payments are telling a similar story. The average monthly payment for a new car has surpassed $700, with many paying more than $1,000 a month. Even used cars aren't affordable. Between car insurance, gas, maintenance, and rising interest rates, transportation has become one of the biggest financial burdens for many households. The real issue, though, isn't just the cost, it's the necessity. Unlike densely populated cities or other countries with reliable public transit, most Americans don't have the option to skip owning a car. Work is often far from home, and remote work options are simply not available for millions of jobs. The commute cycle only reinforces the problem. You need a car to earn a living, but a large portion of that income is funneled right back into the car. All these costs accumulate, leaving many Americans with the overwhelming sense that life has turned into an endless list of unavoidable expenses just to survive, not for luxury, not for upgrades, but merely to get by. And when the basics push the budget to its limits, the next place people turn is the one essential cost they can't avoid: food. For many, it's in the grocery store that the full weight of the cost of living crisis becomes undeniable. You can postpone paying rent, skip a car repair, forego a vacation, or cancel streaming subscriptions, but you can't stop eating. That's why so many people find themselves losing control of their budgets in the aisles of Walmart, Aldi, Costco, and local grocery stores. One young woman captured this reality perfectly when she said that every time she gets paid, she tries to save a little money, setting it aside with the promise that she won't touch it. But even the best-laid plans are falling short, as food prices continue to rise, and the pressure to stretch every dollar grows more intense. 2 days later, she finds herself withdrawing the money again. Not for non-essentials or impulse buys, but for necessities, food, gas, and the bare minimum needed to make it through the next 2 weeks. Every time I put money into my savings, she says, it ends up being needed for something essential. This isn't poor financial planning. It's a stark reflection of how the cost of basic living expenses has become unbearable. The numbers support this reality. Government food plans show that a single adult now typically spends between $300 and $400 per month on groceries, depending on their location and dietary choices. Even after the pandemic-induced price hikes, grocery costs continue to climb at a steady rate of 2 to 3% each year. The hard truth is that food inflation has never fully reversed. It has only slowed, leaving the baseline prices higher than before. This means that each paycheck now stretches less than it did the previous year. But the problem isn't just rising prices. It's also about the types of food available. In many parts of the country, particularly in lower-income or rural areas, large grocery stores have shut down or consolidated, leaving food deserts in their wake. These are areas where the only options are convenience stores, dollar stores, or fast food, because no major supermarket is nearby. Fresh produce becomes harder to find and pricier, while processed foods remain cheap and abundant. As a result, families trying to make ends meet are forced to buy the affordable option, not the healthy one. This creates a hidden cost that most Americans experience, but few openly discuss. Opting for cheaper food today can lead to higher medical bills, lower energy, and increased stress later on. Parents find themselves rationing meals, skipping portions, or substituting fresh ingredients with non-perishable items because their budget demands it. The grocery bill, once a source of nourishment, becomes a source of anxiety. And when even something as fundamental as food feels like a financial challenge, it's natural to ask, if affording food is this difficult, how can I manage everything else? That feeling of falling behind doesn't end at the checkout. It follows people home, appearing in their bills, credit cards, and the mounting debt they carry month after month. This leads to a growing reliance on credit just to get by. For many Americans, survival is no longer paid for. With cash, it's being financed. Not because they are chasing luxuries, but because the basic costs of living have outpaced their wages. One example comes from a woman who shared her monthly expenses: rent, electricity, water, car payment, insurance, groceries, and gas. Then, she posed the question that so many families silently ask at their kitchen tables. Which of these bills can I skip this month and try to make up for later? This isn't irresponsible budgeting. It's the result of a broken system where income and expenses no longer align. Credit cards often step in to cover the gap, but they come with a hefty price. Over the past year, American households have pushed total credit card balances to over $1.2 trillion, the highest level ever recorded. The average interest rate now hovers above 22%, meaning any outstanding balance grows faster than most people can pay it off. A $5,000 balance can quickly balloon into a much larger sum when only the minimum payments are made, and for many, the extra charges and interest are crippling. Most people carrying these balances aren't doing so for vacations or luxury items. In fact, surveys reveal that nearly half of credit card holders rely on their cards to cover essential expenses, groceries, rent, utility bills, and surprise car repairs. Medical bills only add to the financial strain. Even with insurance, high deductibles, and out-of-pocket costs force families to put routine medical care on credit. ER visits, specialist appointments, and prescriptions don't wait for someone to save up. Health issues don't pause for inflation, and when a bill arrives before payday, the credit card becomes the only option. Over time, this cycle becomes routine. Debt feels normal, interest payments are expected, and financial freedom slips further away. Meanwhile, wages continue to stagnate. When incomes stay flat but costs keep rising, credit cards bridge the gap. But this isn't a choice, it's a necessity. Debt becomes the tool people use to balance the life they dream of with the life they can afford right now. However, this tool also becomes a trap, with every passing month increasing the balance and tightening the financial grip on millions of people. What makes this even more challenging is the emotional toll. People know they're trying their best, they're budgeting, cutting expenses, and doing everything they can to be financially responsible. Yet, the math doesn't add up, and they still find themselves relying on borrowed money. With every purchase, the feeling of falling behind grows stronger. If basic living expenses require financing, what happens to a person's sense of stability, their confidence, or their long-term goals? The pressure doesn't just affect the wallet, it affects the psyche, and that's where we begin to see the broader consequences. When the topic of rising living costs comes up in conversation, it often shifts from a discussion about money to something much deeper. It becomes a point where people admit they're tired, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. Tired of long hours at work, tired of constantly battling bills, tired of feeling like progress is always just out of reach. One individual described his routine working 6 days a week, spending nearly 4 hours driving each day, and feeling like there was no time or energy left for the simple things he enjoyed. He wasn't seeking sympathy, he was trying to understand a life where the effort didn't seem to align with the rewards. This feeling isn't unique. Research shows that a large percentage of Americans report daily stress about their finances. Rising rent, fluctuating utility costs, growing debt, and the constant pressure to keep up create a sense of unrelenting stress. Even when people do everything right, carefully budgeting, working extra shifts, cutting back on non-essentials, they still feel as if the ground is constantly shifting beneath their feet. This isn't about personal failure, it's about living in an economy where the cost of achieving stability is growing faster than most people can afford. The emotional consequences are undeniable. Financial strain impacts relationships, family life, and long-term plans. Parents worry about their ability to provide for their children, while young adults question whether they will ever be able to afford a home. The promise of the American dream is beginning to feel out of reach for many, and the weight of that realization is taking its toll. Workers today are left wondering if they'll ever reach a point where they're not constantly playing catch-up. There's a growing sense of disconnection from the future they once envisioned, as the road to achieving it seems to be narrowing with each passing year. This brings the American dream into the conversation, not as a distant ideal, but as a benchmark for how drastically expectations have shifted. For decades, the promise was straightforward: work hard, make smart choices, and life will gradually improve. But that promise now feels much more fragile. The dream of homeownership is now postponed by years, and savings accounts grow too slowly to keep up with the ever-increasing costs of living. economic mobility, the belief that each generation would be able to do better than the one before, has stalled. People haven't abandoned their ambition, but they're encountering obstacles that the previous generations didn't face. Despite these challenges, many Americans continue to cling to a fundamental belief: life should be about more than just surviving. They still long for time with family, the space to breathe, and the opportunity to plan for the future, not perfection, just stability. The fact that people still hold on to this hope proves that it hasn't disappeared. It has simply become harder to attain in today's economic climate. This brings us to a critical question. If the system feels so overwhelming, what can we learn from understanding it? How can we navigate a future where the cost of living continues to outpace the opportunities that are supposed to make life easier? Let's pull everything together in the conclusion. When you take a step back and look at the bigger picture, the housing crisis, skyrocketing utility bills, the shock of grocery prices, the growing dependence on credit, and the pressure it all places on individuals, it becomes clear that this is not just an economic issue. It's a deeply human one. The cost of living in America in 2025 isn't just reflected in dollars and cents. It's also measured in stress, in the time lost, and in the dreams that people keep having to put off because the essentials take up so much of their resources. Understanding the system doesn't mean accepting it as it is. Instead, it's about recognizing that these pressures are not individual failures. They are structural barriers faced by millions of people. The real question now is, which part of this reality feels most familiar to you? The struggle to secure housing, the rising cost of food, the burden of debt, or the constant feeling of running just to stay afloat? If this breakdown has helped you understand why everything feels so expensive with more clarity, don't forget to subscribe and share this video. No one should have to navigate this overwhelming economy alone.